Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for We Keep Us Safe, celebrating the legacy of Yuri and Malcolm. A few notes before we get started. We do have ASL interpretation tonight. If you're having difficulty seeing the interpreter, you can message one of our two tech support folks. They're labeled Nonviolent Peaceforce in the Zoom meeting, and they'll help you get your screen situated. Next slide, please. So this will be a panel on how Black and Asian communities have and will protect each other from the violence of white supremacy. Next slide. My name is Robin Ayers. I use they and she pronouns. I am the training specialist at Nonviolent Peaceforce, and I am currently located on occupied Lenape territory. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to my co-moderator.
Hi, I'm Salah Cyril. I am the current Community Safety Director at VCW, and I am located also in Lenape territory in the Brooklyn, New York, also named area. And I'm looking forward to this. Thank you. Our panelists are really great. So we have Lumumba Akinwole-Bandele, who is a father, husband, longtime community organizer and educator from Central Brooklyn. He's the former National Strategies and Partnerships Director at the Movement for Black Lives. He also serves as a board member for the Center for Constitutional Rights, the Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz Memorial and Education Center, and the Caribbean Cultural Center, African Diaspora Institute. And we'll also say that Lumumba is a dear friend of mine and a wonderful comrade. So I'm really glad to have him here tonight. We also have Joo-Hyun Kang. And Joo-Hyun is the director of Communities United for Police Reform, CPR, and executive director of CPR Action, which is the sibling political organization, C4 political organization. In prior lives, she's been an acupuncturist, consultant to social change organizations and philanthropies, served as the Astraea Lesbian Foundation's director of global grantmaking for LGBTI rights, was the first executive director of the Audre Lorde project, where she developed organizing programs for the LGBTST communities of color, and has been a member and on the board of various organizing groups. And Joo-Hyun is also a dear friend of mine and wonderful comrade. So I'm really, really pleased to have both of them here to have this discussion with us. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Salah. So to get our conversation started, we're going to share a brief video. This is a snapshot of Yuri's legacy to help frame the discussion that we're about to have. If you have trouble viewing the videos, we're going to drop the link in the chat, and I will also send it out to you after this panel concludes.
The friendship between my grandma Yuri and Malcolm X is a great example of the power of solidarity and knowing more about your history and how our stories are connected. Yuri Kochiyama was a lifelong activist, a community organizer, and my grandma. Yuri was imprisoned into concentration camps in the beginning of World War II, I think around 18 years old. 1960s, my grandparents moved into public housing in Harlem. It led them to get involved in a lot of civil rights movements. I don't think we understood how unusual it was that, our time with grandma was going to marches and demonstrations and making signs and, all kinds of stuff. While she was at that point a civil rights activist, she would later say meeting Malcolm was her political awakening. He came to visit her at her home at Manhattanville Projects because there was a group of reporters and Hiroshima and Nagasaki bomb victims visiting who were on a peace study mission. And he really understood the connection between their experience and what was happening to Black people in America. When Malcolm X went on Hajj to Mecca, he sent 11 postcards to my grandparents, and you could literally trace what's happening with him, his own evolution. They were in each other's lives at a really sort of critical time.
Everybody's fight must be to stop wars, racism, hatred, and the dehumanization of humanity.
We're here at the Yuri and Malcolm mural in Harlem. It's called From Harlem with Love. They were born on the same day, so this May 19th will be Yuri Kochiyama's 100th birthday. The mural has been deteriorating over the last few years, so we wanted to come back here and retouch it and restore it. Yuri often talked about build bridges, not walls. And we're coming out of an administration that, you know, tries to polarize people and tries to sow division, especially people of color.
Over the course of my life, from watching what happened in the 80s with the Black and Korean grocery issue and Rodney King and what happened in LA and watching that, and then more recently, what I have felt is that the whole story lacks historical context. It benefits them for us not to see the solidarity, not to see the common experiences. I think what Yuri and Malcolm's story does in this time is very powerful. It shows a different narrative. There's so many ways we're different from each other. There's so many ways that we can connect with each other.
Awesome. Thank you, Claire, for sharing that.
Thank you. It's really, that was beautiful. And I'm so appreciative because the idea of this conversation, we've talked about this, you know, lifting up the legacy of Yuri Kochiyama and Malcolm X, because they showed a level of solidarity between Black and Asian folks that we really want to embody. And, you know, so it's part of who we are, to organize and work together. And I'm really I'm happy that was brought to the forefront. So I want to just take a moment to thank Lumumba and Joo-Hyun for coming to speak with all of us, because when we talked about having this panel, those were the immediate folks that came to mind. I've organized with them and learned from them through my work at CPR and way before that. And so I'm really happy to have both of you here to have this kind of conversation about solidarity in the thought of organizing and community safety and how we can build together. So thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so welcome. I guess I have a couple of questions, and I want to start with, what does the term solidarity mean to you? You can feel free to answer how you like.
Well, you want to go first?
I was going to follow you.
This is what we do.
This is what we do. It's fine. I'll jump in. You know, solidarity is something that I was at early ages of verb, meaning that it's something that is practiced. It's something that you act on. It is something that is tangible and meaningful. You know, it's outside of that, it's an intent, which is good. It's a good place to start. But when we're talking about solidarity, it actually is a very specific, you know, thing that you're doing. So if we're talking about solidarity with particular communities, then it's a way that we actually are interacting with communities in a meaningful way with the intention of creating relationships, creating bridges, and being able to create community.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. I feel like the one thing I would add is that it's the way that we take action to really show care and protect each other. But it's not just on an individual basis. We've got to be able to see it in the context of power, the context of where we are right now in terms of global capitalism, in terms of racism and everything else. And that understanding that has to be part of how we relate to each other and show up to protect each other and ourselves.
Yes, yes, showing up and solidarity as a verb is exactly right. Thank you. Yeah. One of the things that we saw, we said Yuri describes the time that she met Malcolm X as her political awakening. What was that for you? What was that political awakening for you? I think that's for you, Joo-Hyun.
So we're doing rock, paper, scissors, and I was waiting.
Yeah, yep, that's what's happening.
I feel like for me, I feel like there's not one political awakening, meaning that even in this last year, I feel like I've had political awakenings. And so I feel like part of, at least for me, it's about being open to learning to completely change and alter our worldviews and be open and humble to learning that. But one of the moments that was a kind of aha moment for me was when I was in my early 20s. I met, the first time I met Barbara Smith, who, one of the things that really stuck with me is when, I don't even remember why I met her, but when I met her, as a Black woman, as a woman of color who was very specifically anti-capitalist, and identified as a socialist or a practicing socialist, however you want to call it, in a time where I don't really have that around me in terms of women of color specifically, and also growing up as a Korean immigrant with so much of the Korean community being very, her being anti-capitalist and so much of the Korean community being so strongly anti-communist, especially because of the legacy of the Korean War and US imperialism. So I feel like that was an aha moment for me in terms of thinking about being more, thinking about how to think about the world differently. And also some of the work she was doing at the time was I think she was still working at the Kitchen Table Women of Color Press, which at that time was one of the only, or actually the only women of color run press in the country. And had done books like they published Homegirls, This Bridge Called My Back, A Comrade as Precious as a Rice Seedling, and just thinking about what cultural production meant. I feel like those two things were moved me at the time. But again, I feel like I probably had a political awakening last week too. So.
That's right. That's right. They keep coming. Thank you. How about you, Lumumba?
Yeah, I agree. If we're lucky, we
Right.
have constant political awakenings and constant aha moments. One of the things that was shared with me by some of the folks in the movement for Black Lives was this refrain that we are doing this work in order to be transformed through it. And so we aren't doing it just to reach a particular objective, but we're allowing ourselves to be transformed through this. And so we talk about, I'm answering the first question also again here, but we talk about what this transformation looks like. The solidarity that we are getting ready to talk about is something that, at least for my relationship, both with Joo-Hyun and some of the other folks in our circles, came through work. It came through years of struggling together, studying together, laughing together. Those kinds of things help, create those kinds of both personal bonds, but communal bonds and political strength.
Okay. All right. Well,
but my aha moments have varied throughout the years. I don't have a particular moment of consciousness because, I have both a blessing and a curse of being born in this movement. My childhood was very similar to what Akemi had talked about in the video of spending time, preparing for boycotts and demonstrations. In fact, I met Yuri through my father, who worked with her. So my childhood was always a part of movement. But one aha moment, I think, that gave some very specific clarity and purpose to the work that I do now was in 1995 at a conference we were doing at Medgar Evers College. Asa Bache organized this training conference, and we brought in Safia Bukhari to speak to a number of young people coming from street organizations known as gangs, college-based organizers, community-based organizations, political radical organizations all together. And we were preparing to actually do some work around police violence. And she gave this very strong, passionate speech about the urgency of saving the life of Mumia Abu Jamal, because he had just received a signed death warrant from the state of Pennsylvania. They were planning to execute him August of that year. And when she laid out why it was important that the whole concept of political prisoners meant that everybody sitting in that auditorium could possibly be a political prisoner because of the work that we were doing, because that we were really intentionally and explicitly challenging the state, challenging white supremacy, put us in the context of possibly becoming a political prisoner. That was a good aha moment for me. That was like, okay, so we actually have to shift gears and do both and. So that was one. And since then, I've been really consistently doing work around political prisoners.
Yes, yes, I feel you on that. Okay. You know, one of the things that came up is that the idea of continuing that work and doing it with your comrades, right? And making sure that you embodied a particular kind of solidarity. So that aha moment, how did it translate then for you, Joo-Hyun, to be connected? How did you and Lumumba connect? That's not in my notes, but I want everyone else to know.
I don't remember the exact moment, but you know that my memory's not always that good these days.
We've been on panels together for decades. I don't think anybody's ever asked this question. So I'm waiting to hear what you say, Joo-Hyun, because my memory is worse than yours. So you go first.
Look, my easy answer is going to be we met probably through Richie Perez.
Definitely, right.
Probably the first place where we actually worked together. We might have met before then, but where we worked together was through a small grassroots coalition that used to be known as the Coalition Against Police Brutality. That included organizations like the Malcolm X grassroots movement, where Lumumba was leader within. I was with the Audre Lorde Project. Other groups that were part of it were some youth organizations and CAB organizing Asian communities, Audre Lorde Project. And then probably we did a lot of work together, mostly a lot in the streets. So I feel like that does build a practice of trust and solidarity. If it doesn't, then it builds something else or breaks something else down.
It's true.
That sounds right. That sounds right.
Do we move before then and I'm just embarrassing myself?
No, that was it. I mean, I don't have any memory before Cap B. So that certainly was it. And Cap B, I think, was the genesis for a lot of, the kind of solidarity work that we're talking about, not just in terms of communities within the Black Asian spaces, but also, for the Malcolm X grassroots movement. I think we had a theoretical understanding of what kind of gender dynamics and sexuality dynamics looked like in movement, but it wasn't until we started working closely with the Audre Lorde Project that we began to actualize what some of those things meant. And those things did influence our politics. We did end up having internal conversations about inserting some very intentional and explicit language around sexuality and how that needs to be a system of oppression that we explicitly organize against. But I think that those were some of the ways that we began to grow both internally and externally.
Yeah, what I really appreciate that is how the solidarity that you built came through work, and it really creates a level of intersectionality across so many lines. And so I'm interested to hear a little more about your work and how you live solidarity in your day-to-day lives.
You mean other than being on 3 or 4 conference calls with this person throughout the day and throughout the you know, that's a good question. And I think that part of what I've learned over the years is big picture, small picture, you know, thinking globally, acting locally. What is our concept of a just society, of a totally transformed, just world? How do we actualize that? What are the things that I need to do where I am to make that a reality, and recognizing the people that I have within my space that can help make that a reality. And so the work that I have been doing that, you know, exists in Communities United for Police Reform, that exists in Movement for Lives, and you know, some of the boards that I'm on really are part of all of that. It's all connected. You know, we are trying to make sure that our work in transforming what safety looks like in Bed-Stuy is connected to the kind of broader global transformation that we want to see. You know, how are we interfacing and reacting and responding and reacting to our neighbors? How are we showing up, you know, in other spaces? It's all connected. And so I think the idea of, and it's a good exercise for us to be explicit in saying how a Cop Watch program that we're doing in Bedford-Stuyvesant contributes to this larger restructuring of a global society that we want to see. And to be able to say that not only in places like, you know, international forums in Cuba, in Switzerland, but also on Nostrand Avenue. Right? How do we make it plain to our community members and be able to say, this is why we do what we do?
Something Lumumba said made me think about your first question, Salah, around how we define solidarity. And one of the things where I got challenged when I was younger was a friend of mine, Marta Benavides, who used to be a minister, a Salvadoran minister who was exiled from there for a period of time, used to talk about how she was involved and supported by a lot of the folks who were doing Central American solidarity work. But at one point she turned to me, I remember, basically said, Joo-Hyun, the way to do solidarity for those of you in the US is you have to change your government and change the government's actions. It's not about this group being friendly with me or this group just sending us money. It's actually, you live in a society, in a country that is inflicting violence regularly on my region. And it's actually your responsibility to change that. Like, that's the solidarity of that. Mm-hmm. And so I think about that a lot because think about that a lot in terms of local work here for us in New York City. And just how we live accountability and how we actually think about who we're accountable to, not just the individuals, but the communities that we're accountable to, whether it's in New York City or in another part of the country or another part of the globe, and how we act that out all the time. And I think, you know, I feel like sometimes I'm better at that than others. Sometimes I fail miserably. I think one of the things, the story of at least me starting on staff with Communities United for Police Reform a bunch of years ago was that I actually wasn't going to apply for the job. I ended up deciding to apply for the job because I thought it was a good experiment worth trying. I didn't think it would last for more than a year or two. So I thought I was going to be in and out. But separate from that, I remember, and Lumumba, I don't know if you remember this, but I specifically called you in terms of MXGM, and I called Lorde in terms of the Justice Committee at the time, and I said, I'm only doing this if your organizations are going to serve on the leadership. Because for me, I felt like if we're going to do this experiment, it has to be done in a way that's accountable to the groups like Malcolm X Grassroots Movement and the Justice Committee who've been doing this work in the city for years. And in a way that is accountable to communities that are most directly policed regularly on a daily basis. So I feel like some of this question around how to live solidarity, I think, goes for me into what are the personal choices we make and how we choose to spend our time, and do we do that in a way where we're building out structural accountability to other people organizations, et cetera. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Now, I'm interested in your the way that you've framed solidarity in action. Tell me about your experiences with the Third World Within and Racial Justice 911, 9/11. Tell me about that.
You see that smile on her face? I'm gonna let her go first.
No, I'm laughing because I want you to go first.
That's a big part of actually how we were able to experiment with solidarity on a much broader scale. So Coalition Against Police Brutality, which Joo-Hyun talked about as being a very small coalition, and when I say small, literally it was no more than like 6 organizations at one time, literally, you know, and that was intentional. But in conversations, particularly after the 9/11 attacks, and what subsequently happened after that, which was the onslaught, both domestically and internationally, of communities of color by US agencies, police in local spaces, and then military in international spaces, and how we needed to make sure that, number one, we reframed what the issues were. There was a heavy anti-Southeast Asian sentiment that was being sent throughout the media, anti-Islamic, very Islamophobic sentiments. And so we decided that we had to actually shift that narrative, which was a very humongous task, because, you know, saying anything in opposition to the police after 9/11, we're talking about immediately after, you know, you were probably inviting physical confrontation, and certainly to do that on a larger scale, to talk about the foreign policies of the United States was also doing that. So while everyone is waving flags, mostly, in fact, people of color, to do that as a defense mechanism, to say, I'm not, you know, one of them, I am pro-America, you don't have to hurt me, which is a whole nother kind of trauma. We made the call to really try to create a different narrative for our communities and be able to show how we can get Black and New African communities to show us standing in solidarity with folks from Pakistan, folks from Bangladesh, folks from Korea, folks from you know, all across the world, with a very specific set of intentions around creating a different narrative as to what our world was going to look like, and how the work that we were doing locally was a part of that. And so Racial Justice 9/11 was a reframing of what the media was putting out in terms of who the enemy was and what kind of environment was supposed to be happening. And so Third World Within was another attempt to really try to bridge communities, both within not just New York, but globally, but also specifically within the United States. And so we had a number of different left, mostly organizations of color, who were a part of this larger conversation about connecting our work and connecting our agendas into making sure that we weren't functioning in silos and allowing this narrative to really split up what our communities could and should be doing.
I think one of the things in terms of Third World Within is that it started before 9/11 happened. And actually, when the Coalition Against Police Brutality started it was in part because we knew that there was going to be this UN World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa. And the groups in the coalition had been doing some regular study with each other for a period of time in terms of how state violence, how police violence impacted our various communities. And some of the thinking was, while we were doing that, we were also trying to understand how police and state violence worked around the globe, not just in New York. And so we as we developed more of an internationalist understanding collectively, I think we also decided to try to send a contingent of mostly New York youth of color to the UN World Conference. And when they came back to do the debrief, and this was a World Conference where the US's Zionism really showed. A number of folks who were part of the delegation that we sent really protested that. But when they came back to do the debrief, I think it was like the night before 9/11 or 2 days, 1 or 2 days before. And so they did this debrief of kind of the powerful experience they went through in terms of understanding how racism works more globally. And then 9/11 happens. But in some ways, things like Racial Justice 911 or Third World Within or some of these other offshoots wouldn't have been possible had there not been some practice and history of doing actions together, doing study together for the furtherance of those actions, for the furtherance of trying to really change things in New York City. And so all the ways we failed, I feel like we've learned so much.
Wow,
I think part, I'm sorry, look at the part of what made that really powerful, because we had, again, this sort of global and local approach to it. And so we had many people who had a very sharp analysis around international dynamics, but we had that coupled with an analysis as to how that impacts domestic workers, how that impacts cab drivers and their relationships to our communities. And, you know, so that was, I think that was the real gem of that work. And so it was really applicable in terms of the analysis of what was happening around the world.
And I think where we were lucky is I feel like we were being guided by folks around us who were clear that it wasn't about getting an academic analysis and understanding about this. It meant that domestic workers were at the table explaining the ways in which they were impacted. It meant that taxi workers, we were also supporting them in terms of strikes. And so all of that kind of joint practice, you know, any of us who've been trained by Marxists at all, we all think about kind of theory, practice, reflection, theory, practice, reflection, revise your theory, revise your practice, et cetera, in kind of a constant stage or a constant discipline of trying to get better at our analysis, at our strategy, at our practice and our work. And I feel like for maybe one of the most important lessons for me in that period was really understanding that all of that wisdom comes directly from people's experiences, and people have the wisdom to understand what the solutions need to be, always, especially if we've been directly impacted by whatever.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. I think something that you've really highlighted in answering Salah's last question is the amount of work that has happened over time. I think something that I've seen in the circles that I'm a part of is that people get really overwhelmed by this concept of solidarity being new and so overwhelming. And something that you are highlighting here in this discussion is that we have a whole lineage of work that we are continuing to build upon. And we have this wealth of knowledge that is available to us. And in that vein, I want to uplift a question in the chat. What have you learned about Black and Asian solidarity through your time collaborating, and what are the challenges? It's a big one.
It's a big one. You know, I'll take a quick stab at that and say that, you know, when we talk about Black and Asian solidarity, our experiences reflected our particular hands in the making of what we are right now, but recognizing also that we are functioning in a longer history and trajectory of Black and Asian solidarity that predated us. Right. So we know that there have been members of our movement who traveled to Vietnam and made some very strong relationships and began to work collaboratively in some of those spaces, the same in parts of Southeast Asia, the same in China. And so those kinds of things weren't new. And so we were really moving in a particular trajectory that was already laid out. And so part of what was comforting was to be able to say that this is not new. Like what we're doing, the relationships that we're building here, this is not new. This is part of, what Robert Williams was doing back in the days. This is part of what, all of these other folks come, some of the left organizations, some liberation movement spaces we're doing. But what we learned was that it is hard work. It is hard work to be able to talk specifically about why we needed to be the architects of what our relationships were going to be with Asian communities, be real clear about who our common enemy was, but also be real clear about what kind of work needed to be done within ourselves and then also within our, collective spaces. And in understanding that we had to do those things simultaneously. It wasn't like one before the other. We had to really do some self-reflection to figure out how we needed to dismantle some, things that were, problematic in how we saw things. And we had to make sure that we were, doing political education. And we had to make sure that political education wasn't just the only way that we were building, but we had to do it through practice. So while we did reading, we, spent time, going to different organizations in their spaces. We actually, we broke bread. I mean, literally, at our meetings, we would eat together, so those kinds of things I think were important. And for me as an educator, I made the intention, the explicit intention of taking my students to different community organizations, because I teach community organizing class. And I made sure that some of those were organizations that were rooted in some of the Asian communities, so that people could actually see and to see how my students walk away from those experiences, those conversations, makes it all worthwhile, for them to be able to say, many of them go back, many of them want to figure out how they can learn more. And so again, those kinds of things, if you've ever traveled internationally and you figure out just the connections that we have internationally, but see that happen locally, it's almost the same kind of thing. It's like, we have these imaginary boundaries and walls that literally don't exist if we just take a train ride, but again, it's a lot more in terms of what we need to do to build real work, but it's certainly doable. But also the alternative is that we allow the state to win, and we can't do that.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with everything you said, especially kind of the long lineage that we benefit from and whose shoulders we stand on, but also globally. I think the two things I would add is, one is that I feel like, especially over the past year, I don't know that it's a new trend, but I feel like I noticed more folks talking about Black Asian solidarity in a way that was devoid of a political vision that was common. What I mean by that is that you have banks and other folks sending out messages saying whatever they're saying about Black History Month or Asian Heritage Month, what have you. And that's not what we're talking about in terms of solidarity, right? We're not, at least we're not talking about just having more Black and Asian capitalists. What we're talking about is a vision that we're moving towards to try to have everyone live with dignity, live with health, live with wellness, live with all the needs that they have being met and being really able to thrive. And if we're, for those of us who have that political vision, then the solidarity needs to be based and collaboration needs to be based on how do we move towards that vision in everything we do. And I think what I want to just lift up is I feel like a lot of the kind of activist solidarity talk is too focused on individuals, and that's more like friendships, and not focused on that there's a political project that we are trying to be in solidarity in, because we know that none of us can be free until we all actually move this. So I think that was actually one of the murals or one of the signs in the video that was shown at the beginning of this, something about the only way to get freedom for ourselves is to get freedom for everybody. But I think that's part of the lesson I've learned, how much capitalism can co-opt things like solidarity.
Right. Sounds like there's a lot of potential for watering down and perhaps like simplifying things so it's just this individual relationship and just like, oh, I made friends with this Asian person, so like I'm good, check my solidarity box. But the challenge is much bigger and deeper, and the work is much wider than that.
And I think if it's all right, I want to add one other example, which is a little bit different. You know, during, I don't know if you remember this, Lumumba, but one of the early years of CAPI, when we were trying to organize Racial Justice Day, there was a whole debate about whether or not to include not only racist police violence, but homophobic police violence. Mm-hmm. And Audre Lorde Project, who I was representing, we weren't the ones who raised it, I don't think. I think you might have raised it, I don't know. But whoever came up with the idea of it, it became a debate. And I remember the interesting thing to me was I was not part of CAB at the time, which was the Asian organization at the table. And I remember that they were the hardest group to get on board with this. And having a conversation with one of the folks there about this, what I realized was that they were also, at that point, not as forceful about putting forward the different ways in which their base was being policed. And so there was a lot of police violence against Southeast Asian young people who they organized, against the street vendors that they organized. And that, for me, some of this relates to how we think about solidarity, that it shouldn't be thinking about it as charity. It's thinking about it as a relationship where we are all trying to move all of our communities towards freedom. That doesn't mean simplifying our struggles to think that everything's the same. It recognizes where there are differences, but it understands those differences are not a product of us, it's the product of how power is structured, and that our fight is a common enemy. So sorry, long about way to just say, I think some of the challenge is also, even within our own communities, how our willingness or not willingness to struggle with ourselves to try to really push what our analysis can and should be.
Mm-hmm. 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 This is why y'all are here. Thank you. You know, it's the idea that, you know, like I said, we thought of you first, right? And not just because you're friends, not just because you're comrades, but because you understand so deeply how the roots have to run through this struggle, right? How the roots have to connect together. And so that's just, it's appreciated. I'm interested, right? The challenges that you bring up, I'm interested in how that looks when it comes to putting together groups that may have not worked together before, right? Because that it involves trust, because it involves breaking bread, because it involves like building that relationship. When we talk about building safety teams, when we talk about building like working together, what does that look like to try to move quickly in the solidarity, like, right? Because sometimes you're like, I need to just, we have work to do. Come on, let's go. But it's not, you know, there's long, deep roots, and then there's also new grass. And so my question is, how does that look for you? Like, what does that look like?
Mm-hmm. I'll give a quick example. I think one of the things that helped to be a catalyst for more in-depth political conversation around state violence and its tentacles reaching not just Black communities or Latinx communities, but how it impacts, you know, Asian communities as well, was the murder of Young Xingwan. When was that? I don't remember. Joo-Hyun, I don't know if your memory clearly is far better than mine, so you probably know when it's
happened. I feel like it's 95, but you know, the year is
so it's after 95. I know it's after 95. But it's in the mid to late 90s. And to be able to have conversations with people about why that was important, but also to have people sort of have their own aha moment saying, well, wait, this young Chinese boy was killed the same way that they kill our children. and to be able to hear from the families express the same kind of pain, express the same kind of rage that they are not getting justice in the same way. And then that opened up a space for people to see that he was only one of so many others that we had not known about before, right? And so to be able to use that as a process to share again what it is we want to see in terms of our work, I think was one of the ways that we helped to create those dynamics to lay new ground, as you say, new grass, or at least a part of it, because again, this is still not new in its broader context, but some of the particular projects may have been. And so I think that for me was useful for, it doesn't matter, where you're from, but when you hear a mother cry because their child was murdered by the state,
right?
You can, it resonates with you. You can connect with that. You understand, and you down with it. You're like, yes, what we got to do to move on this, folks. So I think that was one of the more tangible ways that we were able to unearth some of those challenges, or some of the purpose, I guess, that we had to dig to find that was underneath some of the challenges.
So I'm embarrassed that I don't fully remember the question because I got really involved in listening to Lumumba's storytelling.
It's okay. It's okay. I was asking about how you create how you make the connections with how do you make new fast connections, basically, in order to create that solidarity, in addition to knowing that you have to do long, deep work, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what this says about me, but I feel like for me, it's really two things. One is like, there's no substitute for doing work together. Because it's the way we learn about each other that's different from, in terms of kind of fast moving through campaigns. But it's got to be done in a way that has some element of joy, where we're celebrating what people's contributions are. And the more we can see and name different people's contributions, the more there's a basis of at least understanding that we're in the same fight together. And I feel like that recognition and building out opportunities for people to actually feel joy, experience joy together and name it that way and not be embarrassed by it, helps to move stuff. But yeah, I feel like I'm old school in that way. I feel like nothing substitutes the work together. And that doesn't mean that people are all going to be friends. And I think that's okay. One of the people I like most on the earth, this guy, older Black Puerto Rican artist, Robert Vasquez Pacheco, who Lumumba knows, he used to always say, Joo-Hyun, I don't need to be their friend. I just have to work with them. I'm like, I get that. And I feel like that's okay. It's like a blessing to find friendship also. And that's not something we should shy away from. But it doesn't mean, just because folks aren't close friends, doesn't mean that they can't actually build deep comradeship together.
Right. At the same time that this is happening, I'm talking about the mid to late 90s, there's a number of other things that are happening around New York City. And it's important that I make this connection because things sort of happen in silos. At the same time, I'm working at the Caribbean Cultural Center, and we are producing an annual event called Expressions. And this particular year, we're doing something called Sacred Drums, which is highlighting the percussion history of communities from around the world. And so we have, of course, Olatunji from Nigeria. We have the indigenous folks from here in the States. We had Tito Puente, so like literally like master drummers from around the world. And so we included Sodaiko, which is a Japanese taiko drumming group. And so simultaneously, while we're doing this organizing during the day, and then in the evening, we're presenting this, I think it helped for people to see it happening in different spaces and recognizing not just commonality, but also recognizing the struggles that people are having and how those struggles are coming across through our cultural expressions, right? And how we are attempting to reclaim, defend our humanity in spite of white supremacy, in spite of the cultural of these percussion instruments that now everybody across the world is selling in a village for $5. You can play this djembe drum. You don't know nothing about the history of it. You don't know anything, like you don't know any of its, sacredness. But people were able to connect to those stories and be able to see how that's impacting their very personal lives. So it's not just a political narrative that's happening in this space around policing, but it's also happening in some other spaces. And I think that when we begin to see how those particular silos are trying to tell the same story, we recognize that, again, we're not alone. These things are not happening, in exclusivity.
And I think it's important to name that cultural work is work, that the work that we're trying to do together, when I say the work, nothing replaces the work, it's not like go do, right. I don't know, whatever. There's so many forms of work that we do in movement, and cultural work is so central to how all of our communities have expressed resistance over the years. Right. And there's nothing that replaces that either.
And that's why, if you went to a Racial Justice Day march, you would not be surprised to see drummers, African drummers, but also Korean drummers from Nordatol, so it would not be, out of the ordinary. You would not be out of the ordinary to have, spoken word folks. So it really was a part of how we saw what our movement actually looked like.
That's beautiful. Over the last almost hour now, we've kind of shifted the conversation talking about solidarity in its theory and more shifting into solidarity in its practice. And in that lens, I want to uplift this question from the chat. It's a big one, so prep yourself. How do you build solidarity between Black and diverse Asian communities when material conditions reinforce criminalized and idealized racial myths? And what concrete strategies help communities overcome that? I told you it was a doozy.
Yeah, it is. And what makes it much of a doozy is because, when we're talking about, even Black and Asian solidarity, just those terms are global. Black is global, Blackness is global, Asian is global. You know what I mean? So we're talking about different nationalities, different ethnicities within both, right? And so it's not just one big lump, kind of thing. But the material conditions, again, within those are so different. And so, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time, right? I don't think there's ever an intention to try to solve this entire issue. I know, I'm sorry, I eat elephants in my spare time. We can't be, the magnitude of this is huge, no question about it. But we have to be real intentional about what we intend to do and how our work is actually contributing to what it is we want to see. Does that make sense? And so it is huge, no question about it. But when we are doing the work to shift and represent a different narrative, I think that helps, and recognizing that we have to prepare for the reality of the state continuing to do and push their narrative. And so it's almost like, we simultaneously having to push back and create new kinds of things. I'm not answering the question, I know. But the short answer is that, we have to be consistent. Mm-hmm. I think we have to be real clear and intentional with what it is we want to do and not get bogged down by the enormity of what it is we see before us.
I feel like you answered the question. I mean, I feel like I don't have to say nothing. But what I'll add is just that I didn't feel like you answered the question, though. I mean, I feel like where you started was that Black communities, Asian communities are diverse and global, and that there is tremendous diversity in those communities. But I think that there's not one answer to this. There's so many approaches that we need to take to not only build solidarity, but in some ways just as important, maybe more important, is to dismantle white supremacy, dismantle the capitalism we live under that enables these kinds of myths to continue to drive wedges between our communities. So I feel like it's, there's a lot of different answers. I don't think we can do it in 2 minutes.
It sounds like what I'm hearing from both of you is kind of taking off the pressure to make it this like very clear and simple thing, because it's not and it can't be, but rather being intentional about what your specific goal is within like your role in the community and then working from there.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing.
That's it. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I want to uplift one more question from the chat, which kind of goes back to a few things, Lumumba, you were saying. How have you seen the state use divisive tactics to break solidarity efforts? And then what advice do you have for organizers working to build solidarity?
Yeah, I think the most recent has been this narrative that Black people are the ones that are the most prevalent purveyors of anti-Asian violence across the country. Just as we're sitting here talking, I'm looking at a tweet from Jeff Chang where he's talking about that being a false narrative, like, just unequivocally, it's just not true. But that is what's being presented. That is what, mass media is presenting. And so I think the answer to that is making sure that we elevate our own media platforms. So we have the narrative that we want to present, but how do we make sure it's actually getting to people? How do we make sure that, the stories of what, Black Asian, both historically and contemporary solidarity looks like is being presented, but also what our communities are working towards in terms of dismantling white supremacy, dismantling capitalism. What is our vision for this new global construct is central to what we want to make sure we're presenting. So I think media is a huge part of it, a huge part of it.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like the propaganda is so, it relates to the earlier question, the question that just got asked before too, I think, in terms of the propaganda that pushes forward these racial myths that only benefit certain people we've got to combat that with tremendous political education and deeply in our communities, not just on online programs or social media or have you, but really build out our grassroots media infrastructure within communities of color and do our own propaganda, really.
Mm-hmm. And I think it happens in different ways. And I'm always, want to be intentional in saying that we talk about doing our own propaganda and what kind of new media we want to make sure. I think it's important that we step outside of the constructs of traditional media. I think telling our stories, I think this is where the playwrights come in. This is where the screenwriters, the actors, I think this is where they come in, the musicians. That is a far more effective, I think, vehicle of politicization of media that I think we have not really maximized. I would love to see us do that a lot more.
Yeah. Tapping our artists.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think tapping the artists, yes, and then being able to like live and build in that cultural shift, I think is so beautiful to be able to debunk some of the myths that we've seen. I guess my question is, what advice would you have for folks that want to have these difficult conversations around Black and Asian solidarity with their family and friends, right? We've talked about organizing. We've talked about, being able to build this, build together culturally and like do this work. And what do you think that looks like in families? Like we've heard so many different myths about the way that Black and Asian folks have interacted. And then some things are true in terms of like, the tensions that exist. So what kind of advice do you have?
You know, and I'm always going back to these anecdotes of particular cases that we've worked on. I think the Akai Gurley case, who was murdered by Chinese American police officer Peter Liang, was a very informative experience for us. I think looking at how some of our Asian organizations showed up and the way that they handled that, I think was extremely informative, particularly for many of our communities who say, well, you know, where are they when we need our solidarity, and recognizing that people are functioning on principles. And again, dealing with this whole, recognizing this whole idea of propaganda and who gets heard versus who does not. You know, I think there are so many really gems and valuable pieces of history within these organizations that we work with regularly. And I would tell folks to familiarize themselves with drum, familiarize themselves with CAV, familiarize themselves with Notatol, familiarize themselves with the Malcolm X grassroots movement, familiarize themselves with Audre Lorde Project, all of these organizations who are living that work. It's not just someone's writing a white paper and saying, this is how these things have been happening, but you know, people are living that work. And to join, you know, Joo-Hyun is absolutely correct. Like, there's no way to get around the necessity of work. There's no way we can't get around it. Like, we really actually have to put our hands in soil if we want to see some shit grow, right? We actually have to work. And so I would strongly encourage folks to familiarize themselves with some of those spaces, and, you know, just find out who they are, find out what work they're doing. You know, take my class at CUNY School of Professional Studies. You know, we'll talk more about it. But there's ways to actually, you know, really get engaged and do work. Is absolutely, it does require us, I think, to put our hands in it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think some of it too, like if folks want to have conversations that they think are going to be difficult with family members or friends and stuff, is my advice would be to approach it like an organizer. It's probably not going to be a one-time conversation. You've got to approach it with some humility and having some sense of where the other person is coming from and why they think the way they think, in a way that's not just coming from a place of judgment. And we've got to be willing to struggle. And that's hard to do in family, however you define family, and friendships. But if we don't do it there, we're not really moving the needle. So some of it is actually feeling like we're also organizing. We've got a responsibility to organize with families too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right.
Sometimes we'll fail. Not all of them are going to get organized.
That is true. That's true. There's not always going to be success. That's how we learn. That's right. Speaking of how we learn, if you could go back and speak to your younger self, the version of you who was still trying to figure out what their role was in the world and the movement, what would you say?
That's still me now.
No.
You go first, Joo-Hyun, because I'm like, there's so many lessons. Like, which one do I extract and lift up? There's so many.
I mean, I do think that that's still me now. But I think for my younger self, chronologically, one of the things I would probably say to myself is, like, there are so many things that you don't know that you don't even know. And that's okay, but it also brings, it invites a bunch of curiosity, which is helpful to experiment. Because I feel like we have to keep experimenting. And so I would tell myself to experiment. I would tell myself to take more photos. I think those are the things I tell myself.
Mm-hmm. You know, I'm channeling our collective mentor, Richie Perez. You know, I would tell myself to take better care of myself. I come out of a space in liberation movement where your commitment to work is measured by sacrifice, is measured by how much you give of yourself. And Richie is but one of many mentors that I love dearly who died at a very early age, who worked themselves to a grave. Richie hired me, and I would leave CSS and he'd still be there plugging away at night, and he's there before me in the morning. It's like, did you even go home? But this was a thing. So I think for me, that would be the thing, to make sure that I, pace myself, take care of myself, and be intentional with what it is I want to accomplish, and not try to eat that damn elephant in one bite. I'm giving y'all nightmares about elephants tonight, y'all.
What you're doing about elephants tonight. It's a whole other thing. The Richie thing just made me think also just that I feel like in a lot of ways, Lumumba, you and I are so lucky because we've grown up politically with so many elders. And that's just not true for a lot of folks. And so I feel like I would want to also tell myself to make sure that I'm staying in intergenerational spaces as much as possible.
Yes.
Helping to create intergenerational spaces.
Yes. And I think also I'm probably on my third lesson, right? You only asked for one.
There's a big elephant.
Right. And I think also to recognize that people are watching, that even though you may not consider yourself to be an elder to someone, but people are learning from you. People are watching how you move. I had opportunity a few times to go to Yuri's home. And if you ever been to her home, first of all, it's a combination of a library, a museum. You couldn't even get through the hallway. It's just boxes of stuff. And it's not like pack rat, no, but this is like, if you ask her to pull out, stuff from, the OAU meeting in 64, she'll find it. You know what I mean? But to know that people are watching you, to know that you have to care for other people coming behind you, you have to be intentional with how you share. You have to be mindful of, modeling. And Yuri was very intentional with that. Extremely busy. But when I asked her to do certain things, she made every effort to actually, if she couldn't do it, she would say it, but she wanted to make sure that she was able to share, particularly with a younger audience. And I learned from that, because I know a lot of people told me, it's like, no, I want to go do this panel over here with the rest of my peers, whatever. But to really, know that you're being watched, and know that you actually have to model, the best of what it is we want people to be able to see and do.
Ooh, yes. So thank you. You gave many lessons, and
sorry.
They are important. They are important for all of those we are all still learning, right? Thank you, Joo-Hyun. Yes, this is still you right now. And, we're all still learning, and we all need to continue to build our organizing acumen. We really still need to build our strengths, and don't even eat the elephant. You went from small bites to not eating the whole thing. Just don't eat it at all. That's the main lesson that you want to come away with. Thank you. Okay.
Just happened.
And so I just really, I appreciate each of you because the history and the knowledge and the wisdom that you're bringing to this moment is needed regularly, right? We're getting it in this moment, but we need it regularly. And, the discussion of practice, the discussion of solidarity as a verb, the discussion of really breaking bread and bringing culture into it all is what we want everyone here to come away with. And so Thank you. Like deeply, thank you. And I just want to say, you talked about Yuri's house. I've been to Yuri's house as a child, grew up going there, not understanding similarly that there was organizing happening, that it was part of, I was a child. So the library that you discussed is just, to me, that was the way Yuri's house was, right? The organizing, the protests that we went to, that's just the way the world was. Like, my understanding of Black and Asian solidarity is exactly that. It's the verb. It's like, yes, this is, and it is actually just everyday life. This is what exists. I didn't have to work hard to do it, to practice, to live it, but I recognize that there are some folks that do have to. And so thank you for these lessons, because it doesn't always come easy, and modeling is the way to do it, so thank you. Do we have any other questions from people in the chat? And we asked y'all a few times, and we got some questions. Thank you to each of you that have given these questions. But do we have any more questions from folks before we begin to wrap up? Okay. All right. It seems like no. Do you have any last things that you would like to leave us with? Joo-Hyun and Lumumba, please. Oh, wait, we have another question. What is organizing teaching you about yourself right now? Ooh.
Well, you're gonna have to go first. I'm sorry, you gotta go.
We should take a spin on this, and we should answer for each other. No.
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 Well, the elephant.
No. What is it teaching me about myself now? That you plant seeds. You plant seeds. Things that you work on, you do, as you may pass on, and it doesn't come out the way you want it. But years later, somebody will unearth it and be like, yo, this project that you did back then, I'm doing a research project on it, it came up, and it was like, oh, wow. So things may not necessarily bloom when you want them to, but I've learned that things that I thought were failures actually were just late bloomers. And so, not to be so hard on myself when, like, damn, we put a whole lot of money, time, and energy and effort into that and nothing happened, but now it becomes actually something that's feeding a whole other kind of thing. So everything in due time. So I'm learning that, plant seeds.
I think I'm learning something similar, which is that I feel like this past year plus, whatever, every year has its own challenges, but this past year plus, I think it's marked in some ways by so many people, so many of us having challenges simultaneously, and losing people, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel like one of the things I'm reminding myself of and relearning is just that our individual capacity, our collective capacity, is probably never going to be ideal. And that there will always be things in life that will make our capacity and our path not as smooth as we would want it. And so some of it relates to what Lumumba said in terms of we plant seeds, but some of it also relates to part of what's important is actually building out plans and executing them to the best of whatever our capacity is that day. And again, that's your individual capacity, my individual capacity, or our collective capacity. And each day is not going to be the same. Some days we can really do a lot, and some days we really can't. And that understanding that rhythm is not entirely in our control, I feel like is is a blessing, but it's also just, it helps us understand that change is not a linear process, and that we do this a lot of the time, and sometimes this, but that part of what matters is us continuing to do it.
Thank you for sharing. That was, I think that resonated for everyone, both on the panel and all of our audience members. I want to jump to one last question before we kind of do final thoughts and wrap up. What would you recommend as further study or reading on practicing Black and Asian solidarity?
Well, this might be yours because I don't read these days except for like mandatory.
You know what? I think some of the things that we mentioned earlier, you know, looking at Malcolm's travels into parts of Asia, I think were good. Robert Williams, his interactions, I think are good. But the truth is, and this is a bit of a self-criticism, part of what people should read hasn't been written yet. Mm-hmm. And I think that, you know, that might be part of what needs to happen, at least in a contemporary kind of analysis. But yeah, that's a good question. That's a very good question.
Oh, goodness.
Mm-hmm. I think I just heard Lumumba say that he was going to be writing.
No. Being that you actually will have time on your hands.
Other people heard that?
Being that you have time on your hands, I think, you know.
Not time yet.
Not yet, almost.
People in the chat are agreeing. They heard you say it.
Oh my goodness.
It don't count. No.
Yeah, you did say it on camera. I don't know.
That's true.
Well, we are going to leave you with some like next steps and resources, kind of tying in this question. And I'll go over them very briefly here, just because we don't have a whole bunch of time and I want to respect everyone's evening. But we do have some just reading material and also next steps, so that you can kind of actualize like this incredibly dense and rich conversation and then turn it into a tangible shift in your quality of life. So the first one we've got up is the May 19th project. Salah, do you want to talk about that briefly?
Sure. So the May 19th project is, they've created several videos and posts and it's basically a solidarity project. May 19th is the birthday of Yuri Kochiyama and Malcolm X. And there's a regular solidarity being promoted and requested within that project. So,
thank you. We can go to the next slide. The next thing that will be shared out to y'all is the Building Movement Project and this social change ecosystem map. It's a framework by the incredible Deepa Iyer. So we've talked a lot about what solidarity has looked like historically, and this particular framework is an incredible resource for self-reflection and kind of understanding how to play to your own strengths as we cultivate solidarity and build this new world together. And then there's a brief description of it on the right side of your screen that reads, "In our lives and as part of movements and organizations, many of us play different roles in pursuit of equity, shared liberation, inclusion, and justice. And yet we often get lost and confused, or we are newcomers to ongoing social change efforts and don't know where to start, or we are catalyzed into action in the midst of a crisis in our community. This is a framework that can help individuals, networks, and organizations align and get in right relationship with social change values, individual roles, and the broader ecosystem. This is, not gonna lie, one of my favorites. This framework was so instrumental in my own journey in figuring out how I needed to fit into the world and fit into different spaces of social change. And I very much hope that it's as useful for you as it has been for me. Next slide, please. Salah, this one's you.
Yes, it is. So you heard about Vision Change Win, and one of the things that we do is we have a community safety training series. It's monthly, and it's a 101, 201, and 301. The training series is a chance for organizations to develop and deepen their safety and security infrastructure, right? And so at each level of the training series, we want organizations to learn concrete strategies for identifying and addressing potential risks and developing safety structures at a scale to the organization's unique capacity, adaptive to changing conditions and trauma-informed. And it's not just for individuals, it's not just for organizations, it's also for individuals. So, we offer introduction to safety and de-escalation, safety for direct actions and events, and organizational security culture. And our next ones are coming up June 9th, June 16th, and June 23rd. This happens, like I said, monthly. So the same ones will appear again in July. So please train, come together to learn this information.
Thank you. And then from Nonviolent Peaceforce, we are collaborating with Can't Stop, Won't Stop, which is this beautiful organization based in the New England area. And we'll be offering a community safety and mutual protection training. And this one, in honor of Pride Month, will be focused on building out the capacity of queer folks in the New York City area to really remind them of their agency and uplift these ancestral skills that they have when it comes to protecting themselves and to protecting each other. And that will be June 10th. And all of these beautiful resources that we've just very briefly glossed over will be shared out to all of you via email over the next coming days. So do not worry if you missed anything. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing space with us this evening. I appreciate your trust as we dove through some very dense topics and some things that can kind of bring up some discomfort and vulnerability. And I appreciate you sharing that space with us. I do want to toss it over to our panelists one last time if there is anything that you would like to say in closing.
After you, JK.
Sorry, I was just trying to figure out my mute and unmute. No, just thank you for creating the space. It's always hilarious to hear stories with Lumumba or share stories with Lumumba. And I'm gonna keep thinking about that elephant, I have to say. I can't get that out of my head. No, I don't have anything else to share. I'm just looking forward to hearing how people process this and what other folks decide.
Yeah, thank you all for making space to do this. And I think the takeaway is the refrain, the hashtag that we keep us safe. And, that has been the reality of our communities, forever. And that still remains. And so, thank you for elevating that.
Thank you. Salah, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I did. I just wanted to say I really appreciate this space, and we want to ask all of you that have come to kind of think about what organizations you may participate in, think about what ways that you can participate in solidarity with each other, what ways you can build your community safety skills and network them and create safety teams, right? We want you to walk away knowing that it is possible for there to be safety teams that exist in solidarity, that are strong. So thank you.
Thank you. I also do just want to shout out our amazing ASL interpreters. Thank you so much for supporting this space and for helping us make this panel more accessible. Thank you everyone for coming and for sharing conversation. I wish you a restful and generative evening. Take care of yourselves, build solidarity with one another, and we will see you next time. Bye everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.